like I said, I'm an ecologist. In 1999, I was doing my undergrad. I was in my third year and I first got exposed to orchards, and a fellow by the name of John Wilson, a few of you might have remembered him, he's passed now unfortunately, but he was the group leader of the initial amount of research that went into rodent control in Australian macadamia orchards. And partly this research, it was funded by Horticultural Australia back then, I know it's changed names, but partly this research was to see if we could utilise all the information we had from Hawaii in the same way. And to be honest, the systems operate very differently for a lot of reasons. They are behaviourally very different as a system, and subsequently rodents behave different in those systems. Then further research, I started my honours and I was looking at something, I know a lot of people have talked about things like nut removal or storing of nuts that rodents do, that you find these big stores. And we were saying, well, does this actually occur? And we'll talk about that. And then there's been subsequent research as we've gone on. So instead of though just bringing you through a tour of the research and boring the crap out of you all, what I'll start, I thought, is let's think about the way we look at things, okay? So at the end of the day, whatever involvement in the industry we have, at the end of the day, we want healthy nuts. We want lots of them. I heard we want over 50,000, that's what we want to target, and we want yields to increase. The problem we face is, whether it's insects, but now we're going to talk about rodents, this is an issue which obviously impacts our yields, our kernel recovery, all these sort of things. We get impacted by damage caused by rodents within the system. So this is what we see, and we know what did it. So this is what we target, right? That's the obvious approach. We want healthy nuts, we see damaged nuts, we know that critter did it, so let's target it. And we utilise systems like this. Our approach is to kill the bastards. Okay? And that makes us all, I can see all the growers laughing because it makes you feel good. I remember I worked many years ago, I was working on the Atherton Tablelands, one of the small production systems up there. I think there's only one farm up there. It's the only part of Australia where a native rodent causes the problem in macadamias. Euromys cautomaculatus. You guys think you have a big rat? That species grows to about 1.3 kilos, is about 700 millimetres tail to top. So you don't have a problem. Everything needs perspective sometimes. But one of the things the farmer used to do, because they burrowed through the system as well, through the orchard, I remember going there one day, we were doing some trials, and he was just kicking over burrow mounds with his feet, and he shoved these quad bike exhaust in one, and he left one open, and he walked out and grabbed his shotgun. He walked over and he just started shooting. And he looked at me, I'm not going to repeat the words, but effectively what he said, I know this is useless, but it makes me feel really effing good. All right, but that's our approach, right? And our tools are shotguns, our tools are traps. Not, to be honest, the species, and I'll talk about the species that cause the problem, is traps are a bit useless. Our tools are fumigating burrows, our tools are flooding, our tools are all these things which all work at killing rats, no doubt about it. However, it's not really targeting the issue, and the issue is the orchard. Okay? That is the problem. Now, I'm not saying there's an easy solution, go and chop your orchards down. Not so good for your incomes, but like any pest pressure thing, we really need to step back and look at what the problem is and what can we change that maybe drives that problem. You know, things like this, and this is some of the early research, not so great looking, but this is also an orchard. Half of it's the orchard, half of it's vegetation which is harbouring rodents. And it plays a really important role in the damage process. So we talked about integrated pest and disease management. I've got to put the D in, Femi, sorry. But from a pest perspective, from a rodent perspective, what do we need to do? And monitoring is essential. Now, like I said, Rattus is the species that causes damage from farms, from Nambucca effectively, all the way up to Rockhampton. It's an introduced species. I'll talk a little bit about its life history in a moment. But trapping is going to be ineffective. You can snap trap them. You can't live trap them because they're too smart. You'll only really snap trap juveniles or the odd adult that's stupid. They are really an intelligent species, and that's why it is the pest that has spread across the planet, along with a couple of other species. There's only 3 commensal rodents that have made it all the way around the planet. In Australia, we have 60 to 70 native species of rodent, but 3 are pests. So it says something about the way they behave. Habitat manipulation, changing that habitat. We talked about in bringing insects, beneficials in. That's about changing the habit. We talked. I saw the winner of the State of Origin talked about management of soil, changing the habitat. These aren't going to conflict all the time. Sometimes you've got to consider how you do it, but how do you manipulate that habitat to manage the pests that you're targeting? Resource management. Now the resource is either macadamias, the resource is non-crop resources. How do you manage that? And then look at the pest control, the baiting, the fumigating, and all those sort of things. But any one of those things only work when they all cross. That's the sweet spot. That's what we're trying to achieve. You've got a species, and I'll talk about Rattus. So just some figures to keep in mind, and I use this, and everybody says they breed like rabbits. Rabbits don't breed when you consider this species. It lives to about 18 months, okay, 1.5 years in the wild. Sexually mature in 2 to 3 months. Gestation period of about 22 days, 21 to 22 days. 5 to 10 per litter, about 6 litters per year. And they're sexually mature, I think I've said that, in 2 to 3 months. So you can see how the numbers start increasing. You're going to have a lot of shotgun pellets to knock that off, okay? You're going to use a lot of bait if you're just going to rely on baiting, because they're just going to keep on coming. So how do you manage the system? So like I said, if I take thinking about the early research, let's see what it means to us and from a management perspective. A lot of the early research was done around here, around Austinville, and around Mullaney. So primarily because it was done through the late 90s, early 2000s, and these were the 2 obvious dominant growing regions and most mature plantings. And a lot of the work that was done on it just happened at that time was a lot of the older Hawaiian cultivars dominated the orchard systems back then. And that's important, we'll get to that in a sec. We confirmed the species, it's Rattus. Now in Hawaii they have 2 species, they have Rattus and Rattus norvegicus, but we only have the one causing the problem in Australia. It's an introduced rodent, it's an agile climber, so it moves through the trees incredibly well, but it also created significant ground burrows. So it was living in burrows but moving in the trees to feed. We confirmed, and this is a lot of different research that went through, but we confirmed that damage, for 90% of the damage process that's happening on farm or in orchard, occurs within the trees, okay? But rodents were removing nuts. The interesting point here is they're not storing them. They're removing it for a really small component of the season to take them over, to basically sustain the population. I'll talk about that in a second. So if we took damage estimates, now this is difficult because it's not orchard-wide. Orchards are variable, but in portions of the orchard, now anecdotally people were talking about 30%, and some parts of the orchard we were definitely seeing that, particularly around fringes associated with non-crop habitats. That's the sort of level of damage that we were looking at. The problem was nobody was counting nut removal, and that was the project I worked on. The way we did it, so people are going, well, how do you estimate that? How do you show where damage is occurring? So we built these cages, if you like, that nuts could fall in, but rodents couldn't get in and out of, or couldn't get into. That confirmed how much the yield per square metre, or whatever that size dimension was, but it also confirmed, and these were over many, many, many trees, not just one, but it also confirmed where damage, you can see the proportion of damage that's coming down. In an equivalent area associated with the same tree, we had an area where rodents could forage back and forth from. So what we were seeing is the same amount of damaged nuts, that's confirming it's happening in the tree, but all of a sudden the amount of non-damaged nuts was significantly lower. So they were taking whole nuts away. And if you add that up, because when you do your harvest you don't see that, when you add that up, your damage estimates, this was first row of the trees across I think a few blocks, I can't remember exactly, they were between 72 and 93% of the first row crop was being lost in some way, whether directly or from removal inside. It's significant. And these squiggly lines, I'm going to try to explain, they actually mean something. If you think about, this is the way rodents within these systems utilise the food which is available to them. When nut is present, the solid line is nut in tree. So when nut is present in the tree, they feed on it, and they feed solely on it. And as it declines, as you know, the nuts are dropping, obviously the rate of feeding declines with it. That's logical. It gets to a point where there's no nut in tree, they can't be eating that. This dotted line are non-crop resources, things like grass seed, wild tobacco, wild lantana, all those types of seeds. Now if you think about the way in Australia, most of our weedy plants don't tend to seed through winter, but they're sort of fruiting through a lot more parts of the year. And that's when they utilise those resources. Now swapping between them, but that's when they utilise those resources, with a dip around the winter months. That dip around those July, June also corresponds by chance to a period of time when there's not a lot of nut in the tree. It's starting to come down. So they need to supplement their diet. That's when they start carrying the nuts away. It happens for about 2 to 3 months. It's a very defined behaviour to deal with a situation. Okay? It's very energy expensive. This is not a species that's like chipmunks that have the morphological adaptations to cache. They can't store things. They can't hibernate. They can't shut their metabolic rate. They need to keep energy coming in. So they've made a decision that I need to get food somehow. The only food is down on that orchard floor. I'm going to move it and I'm going to consume it. But I'm not going to consume it on the orchard floor because that's dangerous. Okay? You're a rat. What are you worried about? You're worried about a big owl coming and getting you. Okay? So move it to a place that's safe. And that's what's happening. That's why you find these stores under places, in burrows of all consumed nuts. That's what they're doing there effectively. But then as time, so that sort of body of research ended around 2003-04. You'll see on some of the references down below, I say it ended 2003-04, but the papers came out in 5-6. That's my fault. I'm a really slow writer, so I took a while to get them out. But then in 2010, I actually came back working with the industry. I had a couple of honours students of my own. And we started to see that that classical model wasn't holding true exactly. And when you think about it, orchards are changing. If you think from mid-90s to 2010, 12, 13 to now, orchards have changed. You know, the bare earth policy has sort of disappeared. As much as they were beautiful to walk through and they were clean, there was no grass, that has changed. The cultivars we utilise, a lot of them are new. There's more and more cultivars coming through. And that has impacts on production season, lots of things, resources that are available. So what we did, we had 2 different students and they were working primarily in the Bundaberg region because there was speculation, or not speculation actually, there was evidence from farmers that actually now the rats are building burrows in the trees. Okay, so they're not building burrows in the ground, they're building them in the trees, which is a total change from the way the system used to operate. So what we did is a couple of things. Let's have a look at planning regimes, densities, to see if that impacts, because that had also changed. The old research was done on really classical 8x4, 5x10 sort of open plantings. But now in Bundaberg there was a guy planting at 5x2, there's 7x3s, 6x3s, 8x4s. Let's have a look at that. Does that impact damage across a standardised cultivar? And the answer was no. That was pretty consistent. There didn't seem to be an impact. It's only a very limited study, but there didn't seem to be an impact. The other one was, let's have a look at the influence of cultivar. Let's look at some of the common ones that were up there. A4s, A16s, A268s, and a couple of the Hawaiians, 341s, 744s. And there did seem to be an impact on, with A4s and 16s being the most susceptible. Why that is, there's a couple of things that may, and I'm not saying we should not plant A4s, A16s. I think we should just be wary about them and maybe realise that they are a risk in certain scenarios. And I think there's a couple of reasons. One, they are a thinner shell, a significantly thinner shell than the other varieties. The other thing is they tend to have a longer nut availability season for a couple of reasons, but primarily I think it's because they hold so much resource in the tree, the stick tight issue. So you've got resources sitting in the tree and can go for a long period of time. So now all of a sudden the rat's going, well, why do I need to go to the ground? I've got everything I need in the tree. And it'll limit their movement. It's much more energy efficient. This is a classical predator avoidance model. They feed where risk to minimise risk. They don't want to feed on the ground if they don't have to. They feed in the trees, it's safe, and then they move through the resources. Non-crop resources are essential. We know that, so we have to manage that in some way. And they also provide, in some systems, an essential habitat for these animals to live in. And orchard maintenance in some description will be critical. So how do we approach all this and what are the recommendations? So if I would say season-long maintenance, so these are things that should be happening all the time. Adjacent non-crop habitats must be well maintained. Okay, so these are the areas that bank onto another farm, the border of your farm, along creek lines, things like that. And if they're wild and weedy, you're going to have to look at maintenance. And the damage, the data shows it's unequivocal. You manage those damage drops on those sites, like dramatically, and it is cost effective. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean you go to slash and burn and you have nothing there. The work that was done up in the Atherton Tablelands was about replacing it with a native forest type, rainforest. And all that work showed, because the native rodent doesn't exist in that forest type and Rattus doesn't exist in rainforest, that is a viable option. To be honest, it's something, and I said before and people giggled yesterday, but it's probably something you'll get a group to pay for, because community groups are always trying to get more areas that they can revegetate. So there are options there. Managing the grass within the orchard is important, okay, and managing the system. You don't want a feral orchard if you can, keeping in mind that I'm aware of this type of idea. And this is, I think, we'll get to that in a second. Utilising certain herbicide combinations to manage it, whether it's slashing or herbicides. Now, I know more and more of the industry is moving towards Basta for something from a safety perspective, or that type of herbicide over glyphosate. I actually think it provides a management benefit as well, primarily because it doesn't necessarily destroy, it's not as systemic, so it doesn't destroy the root of the plant. So it's more surface contact and you'll keep the vegetation down. You're not just going to go to bare earth. About the harvest, now we spoke about this for things like husk spot and all sorts of things, and the weevil that we were talking about earlier. Harvest regularly and get that nut off ground, particularly from that sort of June through September. You want that resource off the ground as quick as you can. And I realise weather has implications, but try to get it off the ground. And once you've decided, that's it, I'm not harvesting anymore, the nut on ground is what it is, it's not of value, it has to be mulch. Okay, because otherwise you are leaving another resource that they can utilise. So even though you go, well, I can come through in January and do it, you're changing the system. So keep that in mind. In terms of new plantings, we've got to think about what varieties we have and what varieties are planted where. So high risk varieties next to a high risk habitat, i.e. your next door neighbour doesn't really manage his property so well, I probably would maybe consider what varieties are going to go there and maybe look at a lower risk variety from a rodent perspective if that's going to be a high risk area for rodents. That's the type of things that we can think about. And then what machinery access you'll get, that's an important one, because it's really important to get the resources off the ground as quickly as possible. And baiting. Now, I'm not suggesting that baiting, you shouldn't do it. I'm just suggesting be really strategic and focused about it, because it is a lot of effort. Baiting a little bit across the whole orchard, just useless. Focus on the high risk areas and nail them. Okay, that's the way to do it. Bait on the onset of damage, once you start to see it. Bait in the trees, with the exception of the period of time when you haven't got resources in the tree, but it's still on the ground. If you can't get on, you know you can't harvest, but you're starting to see damage, then you start thinking about baiting low down, okay? Because I'm stuck, it's going to be raining for a week and a half, I know there's a lot of resource on the ground. The other thing is those, what do we call it, those insect type strips to encourage beneficials. Bait along those. It's not going to hurt the beneficials. Rodenticides don't hurt the beneficials, and there are technologies which are allowed. So if you think they are harbouring rodents, you can utilise your technologies to reduce the populations there. And then bait considering natural predators. Currently there is one registered bait, and the reason for it is it's a lot softer on natural predators. Using second generation anticoagulants and encouraging owls is sort of like crossing the streams in Ghostbusters. You don't really want to do it, okay? It's not the best option, and it's high risk. The last thing I'm going to talk to you about is something that we have new coming to the industry. So BASF will be launching a couple of new products into the industry hopefully next year. One is Meravon, which is a new fungicide, but the other one is Cilantro. So this is quite unique because it's a really different type of rodenticide. It's naturally occurring, it's not an anticoagulant, it's actually a vitamin. It's vitamin D3, so it's present in plants, it's present in us, but rodents are very susceptible to it. The big benefit is there's no real avian toxicity. There's no secondary poisoning profile by the way it works, so it's much softer technology for non-targets, but it's much more effective for rodents, okay? So it kills quicker, and once they have a lethal dose, once they've ingested a lethal dose, with anticoagulants they can still feed, so they still are a menace to the orchard until they die. With this, once they ingest a lethal dose, they stop feeding on everything. So stop feeding on the rodenticide, stop feeding on macadamias, stop feeding on anything. So it's a much more cost-effective approach, and it's an alternative mode of action. From a residual perspective, although we don't typically think about residuals within orchard systems, and the benefit, it is a vitamin, it breaks down very quickly, it doesn't stay in the soil profile, there are no issues associated with that. So it's a really good technology for a horticultural crop perspective. The last thing really quickly, because I know I'm getting wrapped up, is the bait station selection, okay? I know these are often available. They are a good alternative. I say this openly because BASF don't sell bait stations, so this is not a sales pitch at all. These are a very good alternative. They should be positioned in trees, I get it. The one thing I would suggest, I know a lot of guys, the way they do it is they open it up and they just drop the bait inside and close it up, okay? That's fine. Well, it's fine from a user legality perspective. It's not the most efficient way to bait a rodent. We see rodents as dirty animals. They're actually really clean in many perspectives. And what they tend to do though, is, I don't know if anybody's ever seen a rat eat a macadamia nut. It's sort of like a possum. They sit up on their back feet, they hold the nut in their hands and they chew it. The other thing a rat tends to do, which maybe isn't so clean, is they defecate and urinate often whilst they eat. So if you've got blocks down there and they defecate and urinate on the other ones, they stop eating those. And that's why people go, oh, the bait doesn't work anymore, it's useless, they don't like it. Well, you try it and see if you're going to eat it. Okay, so the option here is, if you want to utilise this technology, is potentially just pinning a wire to it and just hanging it off a wire or something like that. Alternatively, on the commercial type stations, and there are so many in the market, they tend to have horizontal and vertical securing rods. So what you want to do is have the bait so it sits up. It also makes baits last longer. Air moves through them, they don't get soaked when, we've got a really wet climate here, so we've got to consider the impacts of that type of thing. So just consider the technology you're utilising and how to utilise it. Entrances should be along the limbs of trees, okay? Don't, the amount of bait stations I see like this and they're connected to the limb like this, but the entrance, they're not acrobats. Like, you're trying to get you've got 2,000 nuts in a tree, you're trying to get it to eat 2 baits and you're trying to make it hard for it. Like, try to make it as easy as possible and think about that. We're really trying to get it in the system. And other than that, I'm sort of finished up.